76th inductee into the Iowa Wrestling Hall of Fame will be former Cresco and University of Minnesota wrestler Don Henry.
Let me add my congratulations, Rummy, even though we only met once before, 40 years ago in the Gopher Wrestling Room. It's easy to see why I would still remember you. It is certainly a privilege to be introducing Norman Borlaug, and in our hometown, no less. A bit of a challenge to keep it short and not just preach to the choir, but certainly a privilege. We should start by thanking Don Gooder and other members of the selection committee for acting on the nomination of Dr. Borlaug and the board as well. One of last year's inductees, Joe Frank, and I submitted it, basically arguing that there isn't a better spokesman for the sport of wrestling anywhere. There just is no one else around who has had a major hand in saving of 1 billion lives and citing wrestling as an underlying factor in that achievement. And we have to thank Norm for finding time in his still demanding schedule to be here to share this with all of us, including especially his sister Charlotte Culbert sitting right there next to him, cousin Lillian Henry over here, and friend Ada Baker sitting here. My bride Sandy is over there, filming for posterity, I guess. Alan Borlaug and his wife Luann are here. Several people associated with the Borlaug Foundation located here in Cresco are also here. We share your sorrow, Charlotte and Norm, that Sister Palma is not here. Certainly her spirit is with you both and others who knew her. Earlier today, Norm spoke fondly of two others no longer with us, his cousins and friends from Saudi. And they were actually, one actually was a baseball teammate on the Saudi Mudhens, Harry Vala, and his other cousin, Dave Nadfi. About that busy schedule of Norm's, just 4 or 5 days ago, he was in Uganda, Africa. A couple of days before going there, he was in Washington, D.C., being honored by Secretary of State Colin Powell and announcing this year's winner of the World Food Prize. And he had gone to D.C. 3 days after celebrating his 90th birthday at the research station in Mexico, which is still his home base for work and travel during 3/4 of the year. How does he handle all this globetrotting? One of his fellow scientists recently described a trip to China when Norm, dressed in a coat and tie, talked and read the entire flight, and upon arriving went off and delivered a lecture. All of his much younger traveling companions went to bed. Of course, he too was younger then, a mere 88. His special advisor over here, Chris Doswell, is here tonight and would probably have many travel tales to tell, I'm sure. There's also a good travel-related story about Norm and his wife of 66 years, Margaret. Recently, one of his acquaintances from Minnesota told of having teased Margaret about how tough it must have been to be married to this fellow for so long. She blithely replied, well, it wasn't so bad because actually they'd only been together about 4 of those years. Nevertheless, they did manage to have a son, Bill, and daughter, Jean, and have five grandkids. I assume everyone in this audience knows that Dr. Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. And most would know that he has continued successfully grappling with world hunger and famine ever since. This has led many in recent years to credit his scientific, educational, and political efforts in food production with saving more lives than any other achievement in the history of mankind. He downplays this kind of talk, but there are many out there in the scientific community and elsewhere who keep saying it is so and keep honoring him accordingly. In looking at his lengthy vita, or resume, and giving some thought to his career, I've tried to pull together a few interesting items and notions that might not be as familiar as some others to this largely hometown crowd. For instance, did you know he has 56 honorary doctorates, which come from schools as diverse as Luther College and the University of Notre Dame? Iowa State and Columbia Universities, Wartburg and Williams Colleges, and they've been awarded by colleges and universities in countries ranging from Mexico to Poland, the Philippines, the United Kingdom, Pakistan to Norway, India to Germany, and many others. And something which speaks of his unassuming nature and loyalty to Cresco. As you go down this long, long list of honors and awards, all of a sudden, there it is, with no special emphasis, the Nobel Prize for Peace. Guess what follows immediately after? The Cresco Chamber of Commerce Northern Borlaug Recognition Day. Other honors from Cresco and Iowa and Minnesota and wrestling are mentioned throughout the resume and are side by side with those from much more well-known prestigious institutions worldwide. On the issue of all these honors being bestowed, even including tonight's, let me share the important perspective offered by one of his fans when hearing he is now going to have a day named for him in Minnesota, as has been the case in Iowa. It is wonderful that we can recognize Dr. Borlaug in this way, and at the same time, draw attention to the plight of 800 million hungry people on this planet. Dr. Borlaug would want it for that reason alone. And many of you have heard of Dr. Borlaug's reputation as a politically savvy unifier and peacemaker on the international stage. I submit he may have demonstrated these skills to an even greater extent closer to home. Think about the diplomatic talent it takes to keep Iowans and Minnesotans relatively happy, while he tries to remain loyal to both sides of these often warring factions. It speaks volumes that after his speech in Des Moines on the first Borlaug World Food Prize Day, the Master of Ceremonies, Kenneth Quinn, commenting on remarks Norm had made in the speech about Minnesota wrestling, said, "Only you, Norm, could get an Iowa audience of 5,000 to applaud Minnesota winning a national wrestling championship." And in Minnesota, he somehow has even influenced their media to treat Iowa with respect. One seldom sees anything about his University of Minnesota ties without also mentioning his Iowa and Cresco origins. And they are careful to refer to him as Minnesota's adopted son. Of course, like other adopted offspring, he is loved without qualification by his fans up there. In Gopherland, he even has Democrats and Republicans seeing eye to eye on his merits. On his 90th birthday, legislators on both sides of the aisle unanimously voted to designate an annual day of recognition for him and his achievements. In this country, as around the world, his admirers include people from all walks of life, from Dan Gable and Jay Robinson, to his fellow Peace Prize laureate and collaborator in Africa, Jimmy Carter. You may have heard in his recent speech up at St. Olaf College, President Carter referred to Dr. Borlaug not only as his friend, but as his hero. And if you haven't yet heard Tuskegee Institute's production of grade school kids doing a rap song about Norman, the greatest man in history, you have missed something special. Just enter Borlaug rap into Google and you can read and hear it. It's wonderful. I wish I could do it justice. Despite his remarkable career devoted to scientific and humanitarian pursuits far from the world of sports, Norm continues to be a fan of wrestling, attending meets when his still busy work schedule permits. Furthermore, he still tells audiences of all types that motivational lessons learned from competing in the sport were instrumental in helping him overcome daunting physical and psychological obstacles in his battles against starvation around the globe. Many of his professional colleagues attest to his having learned those lessons well. While praising his people and political skills on the one hand, they also use words like fiercely determined, pugnacious, and tireless to describe his efforts, whether it's toiling in the fields, negotiating with heads of state, or responding to certain environmentalists about the relative merits of the Green Revolution. It should just be noted here that Norm also acknowledges that the seeds of these traits were sown and nourished out there with his family on the farm in Saudi. Wrestling was critical in helping reveal that they could, in fact, bear fruit. Or should one say, bear grain. If you haven't seen Jay Wiener's recent story about the role wrestling has played in Norm's life and career, I strongly recommend it. It was in the the Star Tribune up in the Twin Cities last November. Really very good. There's another experience from wrestling which probably influenced his career combating hunger. In Bickle's biography about him, here's a quote from Norm reflecting on his uncharacteristic anger, an outburst at a friend when he had been cutting a lot of weight for days before a meet. "I can't explain how hungry I was. I was starving, and I found out that a hungry man is worse than a hungry beast." It should be emphasized that one aspect of chronic hunger that even dieting wrestlers can't duplicate is the anguish of not knowing when or if there will ever be something to eat. But maybe they can better empathize with it than most. I'm sure Norm is going to talk about his sports experiences at Cresco and how George Champlin got him headed north for Minnesota to wrestle and coach and referee some and help introduce the sport into high schools. And how he even recruited his coach, Cresco coach, to come and mentor him and his teammates in Minnesota. I do want to mention that as a competitor, he was a state tournament participant in Iowa and a Big Ten finalist as a Gopher. Somewhere along the line, he even wrestled at heavyweight once and won. And he also wrestled Chris Flanagan into overtime at a point when he hadn't been wrestling all year long or some such thing. It's an interesting story. By the way, if there's still bad feelings about Champlin and Dr. Borlaug with these recruiting raids from Cresco, just think, if that hadn't happened, Chris Flanagan probably never would have gotten to Cresco. To wrap up, it truly is difficult to imagine there could be a better ambassador for the sport of wrestling than Norman Borlaug. His incomparable lifetime achievements combined with his oft-repeated statements of respect and gratitude for the sport certainly merit this induction into the Iowa Wrestling Hall of Fame. He has already been inducted into others, but I have a hunch that in some ways this one may be more meaningful to him than any. It's in his hometown, and he joined several other past inductees who were his contemporaries and contributed to his life in wrestling and beyond, especially his coach, Dave Bartelma, and his cousin I mentioned earlier, and good pal from Saudi, Dave Natfig. The legacies of all three men will be in the same Hall of Fame together. How about we all stand and get him up here with a chorus of Happy Birthday, Norman. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Norman. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you all very much. Let me just point out that I'm a very firm believer in competitive sports, both individual as well as team, because individually you're always out there alone. Nobody can help you. But in team sports, you got to get everybody to work together. And so it is not just in sports, but in this game of trying to develop and transfer high-yield food production technology to many other countries in the world. This was done by bringing large numbers of young students from the countries back in the 60s, 70s, from North African countries, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, India, Pakistan, and they were indoctrinated in plenty of sweat and mud and dust, high temperatures, rain, all of the unpleasantries. And I used to tell them that these were students who were just finishing their career. I didn't want old scientists for changing the countries they came from. I wanted young ones that hadn't acquired all of the ultra-conservatism that creeps into all kinds of organizations. I wanted them fresh out of university. And they really worked under bad conditions in Mexico. And I said, if there's some of you that don't like this, can't stand this, maybe you better go back and change your field of study to law or economics or nothing against those professions, but you don't belong out here in the hungry nations trying to change them. What I want to say, though, is that I learned a lot from wrestling. I think I was unfortunate in some things that everything that I seemed to be 1 year or 2 years too early to be part of a real winning team. I think I was captain of the football team in '32. And remember, we're a pretty small school then. It wasn't like Cresco is now. And it had a good team. But our fullback, Bud Werhan, broke his leg, and Art Eddy pulled a muscle in his back of his leg, and both were out for the whole year, except for the first 2 or 3 games. I graduated. The next year, Cresco won all of his games. Missed by 1 year, bad accidents. Seems like that's the way it's been a lot on my athletic career, but I've used it, and sometimes I've done some things that have been interesting in other parts of the world. I had the pleasure of introducing Little League Baseball into Mexico, and Pony and Colt also, so my son would have an opportunity to play, and many other kids. And this, to me, was a very important, interesting experience. And I've seen some of those people become outstanding people in their own fields of endeavor. As a matter of fact, one of them was on the Mexican Olympic team, swimmer and diver, and he was captain of the University of Indiana swimming team when he was at the university. But several others I've seen from little boys that had dropped out of school in the 2nd grade. We'd get the pennies together from a team of scientists, get them back into school, and I've seen them, some of them, become top scientists in the world in their field. So there's a lot of this spirit that comes to me, at least came to me, from competitive sports that I've used in later life. And, I think one of the best things I ever did for Minnesota is to hire Dave Bardell. I didn't hire him, but it so happened that, and I guess if you permit me, I'll go back to the Don mentioned. George Champlin, I owe a great deal to George Champlin. And it came about in this sort of a funny way. The year after I finished high school, 1932, was some of the worst depression. There was no jobs. The farm that I grew up on wasn't big enough for Dad and I to be busy. When you could get a job, and I tell this to people in the third world countries now, and they say, you must be lying. But that's what my grandchildren tell me also. Telling them what life was like in this country back in the early 30s. Our memory is pretty short. We don't reflect on it. some way or another, this isn't brought forward to each generation. It's a curious sort of thing. Chris and I were in Africa last week, and I was telling a group of pretty prominent, the best of their scientists in a small meeting, what life was like here in the 1930s. The unemployed, the banks going broke. The Thompson Bank didn't go broke. Just what a disaster it was. Now to come, how did I wandered off to Minnesota. That year, after I graduated, I stayed home on the farm, and it so happened that the Midwest AAU wrestling tournament was held here in Cresco High School auditorium, participating in Iowa State Teachers College at that time before it became Northern Iowa University. Go and University of Iowa State University of Iowa, and I think there was one or two other small colleges. Anyway, I hadn't wrestled all year. I came up and worked out 3 days and wrestled, and I got to the finals and met Chris Flanagan, who had just had a very successful, he was senior and successful career at Iowa State Teachers, Northern Iowa. And we went into overtime, and it was really tough, and I gave him a pretty good go for his money. As I walked off the mat, McCuskey came up to me and he said, "Son, you better come to Iowa State Teachers next year." So, of course, at that time, there was no scholarships, fellowships of any kind in any sport. That's the way it was in the good old days. And so I had planned to go to Iowa State Teachers, but George Tamplin came down about a week before I was scheduled to go. He says, George had graduated from high school the year before I started. I didn't know him. I knew him by his reputation as an athlete. He was a little fast running back. I think dripping wet, he probably weighed 145 pounds, but he could move like a rabbit. And he came down and he said, "My daddy says that he thinks you should go to Minnesota rather than Iowa State Teachers." His dad was county reporter for God knows how many decades here. George's dad. And so he said, "Ride along. If you don't like it, you can hitchhike back." And I said, "No, Herb Upton, who was 135 pounder when I was 145 pounder, we were both going to Iowa State Teachers." He said, "Come on, I'll take the both of you." To make a long story short, we went. George Champlin, those of you who know him, later became vice president of the Campbell Methuen Advertising Company. And he was a salesman from the worst. And I saw him this afternoon. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here, but how does this tie into Minnesota wrestling? At that time, see, there was no freshman competition in any sport as freshmen. You couldn't compete intercollegiately. But they used to have an all-university winter sports carnival in Minnesota. Wrestling, boxing, gymnastics, swimming, even basketball. I decided, well, I'll enter this freshman year, 145, but also the heavyweight. I should, for wrestling then was far different than it is now. And if you went behind in the first 3 minutes, there was no split periods. You went straight through. And to make a long story short, I got a hold of a guy who was later center on the football team, but he hadn't wrestled much and beat the hell out of him. Well, 45, and then the heavyweight, and they're about to my Cresco classmate won the 35. And then as sophomores, both of us had very good records. I think I won 8 out of 9 dual meets, and Upton something on the same order. And our part-time coach, he was a lawyer, McCusick, a very successful lawyer, and one of the founders of investor syndicates. And by that time, this business was getting too big, and he said, I'm going to have to resign. I'm sorry. He did it as a hobby. He had been a wrestler himself. So 3 of us got together, the light heavyweight, Upton and myself, and we told the director of athletics, you better go down to Cresco and hire this man, Dave Bartelma. And we told him about how many people on the Michigan squad came out of Cresco, how many at Iowa and Iowa State and Iowa teachers. And he said, hell, we don't have money to hire this kind of coach. We said, give it a try. Dave Bartelma came to Minnesota, and the first thing he did was he looked around, he said, we have to organize high school wrestling. And at the time when I was in high school here, there were 2 schools in Minnesota that tried to wrestle, but they had no trained coaches. What schools were they? Big schools, Boston and Rochester, and Cresco had really rubbed the mat with them. Maybe once in a while they'd win a bout, but generally not. And so when Bartelma took a look at the scene, he said, we got to change the roots up. And in the fall of the year after the football season, he would invite football coaches from the high schools around close to the Twin Cities for a clinic on Saturday mornings. And then he used to give Bryce Johnson, the light heavyweight, and myself, 2 bus tickets certain nights of the week to go and put on a demonstration. We had a pretty good show, slapstick prose for 2 minutes in front of a parent-teachers meeting, and then get a couple of boys from the PT classes, put on a demonstration, and then ourselves put on a demonstration. That's why high school wrestling got started in Minnesota. So it never really got started until 1936. And then it got on fast. When I went back to graduate school, I was freshman wrestling coach, and I refereed a lot of the high schools that were starting, including Vern Gagne's first bout in high school, and also when he won his first state championship. And so I've seen wrestling in Minnesota grow from practically nothing to 2 or 3 years ago when they finally won the national championship. But it was a long, hard grind before Jay was able to achieve that. But In a more serious vein, the lessons that I learned out there on that mat, and I think my best sport was baseball, playing in the country team down in Saudi and playing all around the country. We had a really good baseball team. And the saddest moment in my athletic career, my first career study was in forestry, where I got my degree. And we had labs in the afternoon. So after my freshman year, I had to turn in my baseball uniform and concentrate on wrestling. Somebody asked me, a vice president, about 8 years ago, when I was in Minnesota, they asked me to do a little recruiting for science students in high schools around the state. I think I spent a week, and the vice president was traveling with me. And at luncheon, he said, "What was the toughest wrestling match you've ever had?" I said, "It was with the Deputy Prime Minister of India." Alone, when all the states, when our technology that had been developed in Mexico had been transferred through these young people who had been trained, tested first on university plots and then state experiment stations and then hundreds and then thousands of farms. And they had imported on the basis of those results. And there's no magic in the seed alone. When you go to countries where agriculture is old, you've got to start with the soil. The soils are all worn out, and you've got to replenish them. Fertilizer. Now it's all in vogue. It's got to be organic. That's all right for organic gardening. Nothing wrong with it. But when people come into the third world and start telling that you can produce the food that's needed for 6.3 billion people with organic fertilizer, this is just plain damn nonsense. And it's going on all of the time. I was trained in ecology, forest ecology, and one of my continuing ongoing battles are with the extremists in the environmental movement, because they live in cloud nine. They have never dealt with realities of the down-to-earth problems of the human being. And so, on this particular occasion, the stage was set. The year before, they had imported 18,000 tons of Mexican wheat seed. Pakistan, that year, 42,000. Turkey, 23,000. Nobody had ever moved more than a couple of 100 pounds of seed across the country border. These were shipped. People starving. And I had seen this crop. It was beautiful. And I got a call from the Minister of Agriculture to stop at a tractor factory that was producing beautiful little 25 horsepower tractors for luncheon. Polish ambassador was the speaker, and this was just north of Delhi, about 50 miles. And so as we drove in, there was probably 250, 300 of these beautiful small tractors, no sale. The ambassador spoke, and the president of the company said, "Maybe Dr. Borlaug would like to say a few words." I said, "Yes." All the press from New Delhi was there, the biggest newspaper. I said, "The stage is set to change everything. If there are three things that your government will do now. One, the seed is here, The technology is here. It's been demonstrated on thousands of farms. The fertilizer commitments are not yet here. Credit for the small farmer to buy that fertilizer and pay for it at time of planting. They have no money. These are 8-10 acre farms. And finally, get the laser off the price controls. The prices being paid to the Indian farmers at that time was 40% less than the price for wheat in Canada or US or Argentina. And then I started to sit down and I said, Mr. President, to the president of this tractor company, if you and your government do those three things, those 300 tractors will disappear in 3 weeks' time, and you won't be able to fill the orders for those tractors for years to come. And of course, everybody's laughing, believing that this was nonsense. Returned to Mexico to New Delhi, the capital, that next morning. I went to see Mr. Gandhi, the Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, and then the President, who gives a courtesy call, and then the Minister of Agriculture. And I told him, we've traveled for a month. The stage is set, except for these three things. He said, yeah, he had the clippings from the morning paper. I hadn't seen them. And he said, I see what you've done, but you've forgotten one thing. I, together with my party, lost 40% of the seats in the legislature last month. I'm out of office tomorrow night at midnight. I can't help you. But he picked up the phone, and this is where the wrestle came. Picked up the phone and he said, he called the Deputy Prime Minister who had survived this onslaught. This was the first time the Congress Party lost 40% of the seats in the Congress. And he said, no, he's leaving tomorrow night at midnight, Pan American for Mexico. It has to be tomorrow. Can't be next week. And he said, I got you an appointment to see the Deputy Prime Minister. He's the strongest guy that survived this slaughter. And so the next afternoon, I went with my young colleague, Indian scientist, Dr. Swaminathan, brilliant. But I told him before we went into the Deputy Prime Minister's office, I said, you stay out of this because I'm going to throw the book at him. This is going for a fall. Not the books this or this now. It's going for a fall. And you better not get involved. I may get thrown out of the country, but if you don't become involved in this, and you and my Canadian assistant who was posted in India can carry through. This was the toughest match I ever wrestled. Out of about 30 seconds of courtesy, and then I said, you, Deputy Prime Minister, won't sit in that chair, just the three of us. You won't sit in that chair a year from now. They'll throw you out just like they threw out 40% of the seats, the people in your party. These people are hungry and they're tired of words. And of course, he exploded, and we both talked in loud voices, not very pleasantly. And then we ran out of breath. I think I had a little more stamina from the lungs than he had. And to make a long story short, he quieted down. He gave me every reason why they couldn't do this. couldn't commit to the fertilizer. They didn't have the money. And the credit, they would never pay back. And the price, we have to have cheap price for food because we got so many hungry people. They kept the price so low the farmer couldn't afford to use new technology. And so I knocked down each one of them. And then he said, you don't understand our socialistic form of government. I said, I've worked with all kinds of governments, communistic governments, socialistic to the extreme military governments on the right. I'm working for people that need more food. And I have worked for nearly 30 years in Mexico, which is very socialistic, not unlike India. Well, we left. We weren't screaming at each other. I went back to Mexico. 10 days later, I got the clippings out of the paper from New Delhi's main papers. As of midnight, April 1st, the policies on fertilizer procurement with intentions to install factories and on credit had all been extended at least till the next year. They've never been changed. Everything changed. That was the toughest, roughest, most, the best wrestling match I was ever in. I've been in a lot of others. Some of them are horrible, but that's when you draw from something within that you learn from athletics. And I'm grateful to all of the people of Cresco, to all of you who are involved in one way or another in wrestling. And I suppose Ada Baker Hampson and I are two, shall we say, oldest Ada people in the room. And many of you don't know that Ada Hampson was Pee Wee Dale Hampson, elder sister. There she is. Ada, older sister. And I'll say this, pound for pound, he was about as tough a wrestler as I ever saw. He came out of Cresco. He started out under Bartel. He came to Cresco, to Minnesota, and he finished there. And of course, he was lost in the Battle of Midwood. Thank you.
Thank you all, presenters and inductees, for really great work. Another very successful induction ceremony. Before we close, we have a few thank yous. Everybody got a program, and on the back of that you'll see our sponsors: Cresco Union Savings Bank, Fortress Bank, the Chamber of Commerce, Mary Ann McDuff. Mary's here. They help us with the program and do a lot of that stuff. Thank you, Mary Ann. Farmers Mill and Cresco Insurance Agency. Cindy Udekoffer at CIA, Jerome's right-hand man. Is that okay? Thank you, Cindy. Scooter and his staff, great supper, great host. Thank you, Scooter. Sour Grain, Print Shop Plus, and Slipka Construction. Thank you all again for coming. We hope you can join us next year for the 36th annual induction. And we wish you all a safe trip home tonight. Bar's open for a little while if you didn't get a chance to talk to everybody. Thanks again for coming, folks.